Welcome to the BBC and our live TV debate on the EU referendum from Northern Ireland. Decision day, it's just a week tomorrow. And the question, do you want to remain? Do you want the UK to remain in the European Union, or do you want to leave it? We've been discussing this, haven't we, together for weeks now. A man that's going to help us with some of the facts and the figures on either side of it is our economics and business editor, good title, John Campbell. And there's a lot to discuss, isn't there?
There is, Stephen. Really passionate opinions on all sides, but sometimes the facts are a bit hard to come by. So as much as possible tonight, I want to concentrate on bringing you the facts.
All right, we'll try to do that. And this debate, of course, it's been raging right throughout the UK.
The United States wants a strong United Kingdom as a partner. And the United Kingdom is at its best when it's helping to lead a strong Europe.
I want a better deal for the people of this country, to save them money and to take back control.
The EU has changed so much since people voted way back in 1975, and it is now, for me, about whether we want to control our own country.
The plain, uncomfortable truth is that the unity of the United Kingdom itself is on the ballot paper.
It's all very well to talk about constitutional uncertainty in the United Kingdom when we're handing away our sovereignty to Brussels all of the time.
If we vote to leave the EU, the country will be poorer and the families in the country will be poorer.
Even if sterling were to fall a few percentage points after Brexit, so what?
It would be bad for our farming community, bad for our community in the voluntary sector, very detrimental to relationships on the island of Ireland.
There's no saving from leaving the EU, there's a cost. And my message is very clear, which is don't risk it.
Voting to leave will be a galvanising, liberating, empowering moment of patriotic renewal.
Should I stay or should I go?
Well, let's have a look at our panel tonight. In the Leave corner, the DUP MP Sammy Wilson, the Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan, from the Remain side, the SDLP MLA Claire Hanna, and from our London studio, the former Downing Street Director of Communications, Alastair Campbell. We're going to get into the audience straight away. Mervyn.
Good evening. Recently released data research indicates that Northern Ireland exports to the EU have almost halved over the course of the last 10 years, whilst exports to the rest of the world have increased by more than 40% to 70% of our exports. In these circumstances, would Northern Ireland not do better voting to leave the EU and seek our fortunes outside?
One for you straight away, Claire Hanna.
Well, the fact is, we do trade. We trade with many people. We don't just trade to Europe, but it is a fundamental part, particularly for the likes of our agri-food sector, which competes on quality and not quantity. So we're not looking to ship out millions and millions of product. We are selling to high-quality buyers, and that's exactly what Europe provides. It's the most stable market in the world. It's 500 million people, and we do it without tariffs. That's not to say we do, and Invest NI is around selling our wares all over the world. We're not just buying in the EU, but that is our primary
market. The bottom line, Sammy Wilson, it's a huge economic gamble, isn't it?
No, it's not.
It's a leap in the dark.
Indeed, it's not an economic gamble. And the figures which were quoted there a moment ago show the positive side of leaving the EU. First of all, our trade is more being orientated now towards the rest of the world, because that's where the growing economies are, unfettered by the economic restrictions which you have in the EU. Secondly, we are curtailed in developing those relationships, because if we want to have trade agreements with other parts of the world, the growing parts of the world, the parts of the world which are sympathetic to us because of common language,
we take about 2 or 3 years to negotiate them, do we?
No, we don't negotiate them at all. Brussels does. We cannot sign a free trade agreement with Australia, India, China, any of the growing economies. Only Brussels can do that for us. And when we joined the EU, the countries that now make it up were 36% of the world economy. Now it's 17% of the economy. We need to lift our eyes to more distant horizons. I was here last week at the Harbour Office. Look at the architecture there. Those were people with a global outlook. Those were blue water, internationalist, innovative people.
They were also
How have we come to depend on this one trade bloc that
I want to bring Alastair Campbell in from the very beginning. Nothing to worry about then, Alastair Campbell.
Well, I think, look, we're not talking about an either or here, Stephen. I mean, yes, it's great that we can trade with India and with China and with Japan and all these other countries. The question that's on the ballot paper is, are we better off in or outside the European Union? And the reality is that Northern Ireland, I think, will be disproportionately adversely affected if we leave the European Union, partly because the extra funding that comes to Northern Ireland from the European Union, but also because of the importance of relations with the Republic of Ireland, which of course is an important part of the European Union. So I think this idea, it's a myth that we're going to be able to create these great new trade agreements.
But neither Alastair nor Claire has addressed the point about the way in which the EU is dwindling. Over the last 10 years, the Chinese economy has doubled in size, the Indian economy has doubled in size, the Eurozone, incredibly, is the same size now that it was 10 years ago. Why are we shackled to the world's only...
Hold on, one at a time, Claire.
Well, it's relativity, and there are, yes, certainly there are growth areas and things will... But you talked, and I was at the same debate, and manufacturer after manufacturer stood up and said that they knew how difficult it would be if they left, because particularly if you're producing stuff, you don't necessarily want to ship it. There are costs to put things out all these to China and to New Zealand and other places like that. So it's as Alastair said, it's not like like with like.
Tell you what, I'll let you come back, Sammy. I promise I will after we hear from John Campbell with some of the facts and figures behind this.
Northern Ireland's contribution to the EU budget last year was an estimated £374 million. In terms of what comes back, subsidies for farming and fishing, alongside what are called structural funds, were £320 million. Special peace and cross-border funds added around £50 million, though we'll stop getting much of that money after 2020. There are also science, education and research funds. They're at least £10 million a year. So at a local level, we're still beneficiaries of the EU, or at the very least, break even. The Leave side say in the result of a Brexit, the UK government could easily afford to replace those EU funds, and maybe even add more. But the Remain side say there's no guarantee the UK government would have extra money to spend, nor that they choose to spend it here. The most economically important aspect of the EU is the single market. It means companies can sell their goods, and to a lesser extent services, right across the EU without tariffs, quotas or other restrictions. That's especially important for Northern Ireland. 60% of our exports go to the EU, though the most recent annual figures show manufacturing exports to the EU down by 4%, while non-EU trade was up by 28%. What happens to that trade would depend on what sort of deal the UK could get with the EU after a Brexit. The Leave side said that any deal would allow businesses to shrug off EU red tape. But the Remain side point out the UK is already one of the least regulated major economies.
Have you, Sammy Wilson, got a coherent vision for trade with the rest of the EU post-Brexit?
Yes, I have. But
spell it out.
But let's just first of all look at the figures that John quoted there. First of all, we are now no longer net recipients of money from the EU. In fact, his figures would indicate that
Northern Ireland.
Yes, his figures would indicate. His figures indicate that this year we are net recipients of £6 million. That peace money will disappear by 2020, and that the farming subsidies fell last year by £120 million.
John Campbell, that's exactly why we have you here. Are we net recipients or not in Northern Ireland?
As far as I'm concerned, we are net recipients at the moment. There's no doubt to me about that.
I think it's worth. I think it's.
John, on the BBC website, you also accept that by 2020, farming subsidies will have fallen further, that the peace money will have disappeared, that our contributions to the UK, to the EU, will go up, and therefore by 2020 we will be net.
There are,
net
I should say, there are other things in there I didn't include. For example, like roads fundings, like the 10T scheme for roads funding.
No.
But some of the so there you know, I think that was quite a conservative view I gave of how we're net recipients. But as it stands today, I don't think you can credibly argue we aren't recipients now.
It is not a conservative
that may change
view, John.
in the future.
I don't think. In fact, John, it's an inaccurate view because you based that £374 million figure on Britain, a British contribution of 12.9 billion to the EU. It's actually 18.9 billion.
Talking about accurate and inaccurate views, are you the two punters that are standing over the 350 million a week that's plastered across a bus that you claim that we're sending out?
Yes,
you claim, Daniel, we're sending out 350 million a week.
That's the gross amount. Some of it is returned in the rebate. Some of it is then spent here.
Let's have a look at the bus. Let's have a look at the bus.
It's not spent.
Where does it say gross on that bus?
Well,
maybe it's gross in a different way. I don't know.
Stephen,
what does it say?
What's the difference between your gross salary and your net salary?
Where does it say in that boss that we're getting money back in as well?
If I say to you, what's basic rate income tax? Do you say it's 20p in the pound, or do you say, actually it's 0 because we get it all back in roads and schools and hospitals? It's normal in public life that we quote the gross figure, which is what you're actually paying.
All right, so hold on. Sit there then, Daniel Hannan, and tell me that we send out 350 million a week.
I mean, it's a digitised age, right? We don't actually physically ship the money over. That appears in your bank account as debited. Some of it is then returned.
It doesn't.
But it's not spent on things that we'd have chosen for ourselves.
Doesn't.
It's very often spent on things, on buying the loyalty of these various quangos that you've just been quoting.
What actually happens is that there's 350 million a week.
Yeah,
there's actually 276 million sent. So it's not even before you get to net and gross. There's 276 actually spent because the rebit's taken out before we spend the money.
We don't put gold in the back of a van and drive it over. It's debited and then returned. It's not.
Alastair Campbell, hold on.
Well, Stephen, can I just make a point here? This is not like we're paying in money and getting nothing back. Our membership of the European Union gives us enormous economic benefits. And the idea that this is some kind of cheque that we have to pay out. The other lie, and by the way, I heard you in the preamble telling the audience not to call any of us liars, but that £350 million on the bus, it's a straightforward lie. And what's more, it's also a lie that it can be spent on the Treasury.
Alistair, that comes from Her Majesty's Treasury. The figures for EU finances for 2015, it's not a figure made up by Dan or by me or by the Brexit campaign. That is an official government figure, whether you like it or not.
Without any context
on top of that, of course, then.
And it cannot be spent on the National Health Service. And the idea that Daniel Hannan, of all people, who wants to privatise the National Health Service, gives a damn about investing more in the National Health Service, forget it.
If we get... It's not just that we get the money back, we will get control back. If we leave the European Union, farming and fishing, which were the two biggest components that John just mentioned, will be devolved directly to Stormont.
Claire?
The question, therefore, is do we trust our own representatives to run these things?
You've got to lose 80% of the
I think this is exactly the point. It's playing fast and loose with statistics. John just stated a fact and you're already undermining it. And you do. It's the price of everything and the value of nothing, because there's quite a lot more comes from the European Union. But I'm going to finish this point. You talk about
government figure.
There are a variety of economic models and predictions, but all of them have one thing in common, that the impact will be big and it will be bad. So presuming we do come out of Europe, even if there's a 1% drop in GDP, it would wipe out the saving. And I think the point is very well made. The Conservatives have shown they will spend money on almost anything except here. And Daniel Hannan, who said that the NHS was a 60-year mistake, is not exactly the person, I think, who's going to spend it on our public services. So we're handing this over. This is a project of the hard right, and I know the hard left are joining in as well, but they have very different views. One of them is going to be very disappointed, and I think it's the hard left.
But Claire, I am one person who is going to lose his job, definitely, if we leave, is me, right? I'll lose a very well-paid job with big tax expenses. I would not be inviting people to fire me if I were not confident that it would be in the economic interests of the country as a whole.
This is really important.
And that, therefore, by the way, there'll be some alternative employment for newly unemployed MEPs, doing something a bit more useful than regulating everybody else.
You are a smart man, you're an educated man, you have all the golden apples in the world, and you make jokes about making you redundant. This is real people's lives. This is some sort of political experiment for you. But this is going to be the biggest economic shock that we've seen. So you can joke about other people don't have a choice.
Young fella here, front row, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think Daniel Hannan's hit the nail right in the head there. Do we trust our politicians to deal with this after we leave the European Union? I think the answer across the board is of course we don't. Do we trust Sammy Wilson, the ex-finance minister, to deal with our revenue left after the European Union after we leave there? I don't think so. The entire campaign's come down to an issue of trust.
Well, the point is, that's the honest answer. You have a finance minister here anyway.
Do you trust unelected bureaucrats and unelectable politicians?
That's the honest argument for Remain.
The point I'm making is
that you'd rather have people who are immune to public opinion making these decisions.
No, the point I'm making is that this entire campaign has come down to a question of trust. Do we trust the Leave campaign and do we take a step out into the unknown, or do we trust the Remain campaign with what we've seen before?
So we showed you that bus slogan that we're sending over 350 million a year, OK? They didn't tell you on the bus. I've written down the figures. We get 88 million of it back before we send a penny of it out, right? Also, and that's 88 million to farmers. There's 27 more million on research. None of that's on the bus. Actually,
19 million to fisheries.
The net figure that we send out is 160 million.
And there's more we get back in private sector
Still quite a lot of money
as well.
It's
Still quite a lot of money. Still enough to have wiped out the entire austerity programme in the last Parliament.
But it's not 350 million, is it?
All right. 42 million gross, 85 billion net in the 2010 to 2015 Parliament, enough to have wiped out the whole of the cuts programme, even if you take the,
Stephen,
the lower
figure. Just kind of to clear up finally the number on the bus. We'll go to, not me, we'll go to Sir Andrew Dillnett, Chair of the UK Stats Authority. So he is the man who knows all the numbers. What he says, the continued use of a gross figure, that's the 350 million, in context that imply it is a net figure, is misleading and undermines trust in official statistics. That's not me. That's the head of the UK Stats Authority. And I should say, the UK is a net contributor to the EU budget. Nobody's arguing with that. So why invent this figure, which Sir Andrew Dillnett says is wrong?
Well, it's for the same reason that if you say, what's your council tax, you answer what your council tax is. You don't say, well, I'd better deduct the cost of the street
Stephen,
cleaning and the street lighting.
Yes, Alastair.
Look, to be fair to Daniel Hannan, I think he probably, in his heart, doesn't want to justify it, but he's part of the campaign. He feels he has to. Boris Johnson made a calculated decision to lead this campaign, partly because he's got his eye on the chance of becoming the next Prime Minister, because he knows that David Cameron's going to go. And he is actually, I don't enjoy particularly talking about this 350 million. He loves it when we're talking about this sort of stuff, the tactics of the campaign, because it means we're not actually talking about the substance. Are we better off in or out? And I think if we got back to that, we'd be able to hopefully put a bit more light on this.
And Alastair, the substance for the economy is that regardless of whether it's a net figure or a gross figure, we do make a huge contribution every year to the EU. We lose out on trade opportunities with the growing parts of the world. For example, Switzerland has trade agreements worth five times more than the EU has with growing parts of the world. Chile has trade agreements worth 10 times more than the EU has with growing parts of the world. And we are then burdened with billions of pounds worth of red tape, which stifles small industries.
Let me ask a question to Claire Hanna. Hold on. Claire Hanna, your party used to tell us that Northern Ireland should end the single currency, didn't it? The Eurozone. You were wrong about that, weren't you?
Well, for a start, there were a number of tests, and the fact is this isn't about the euro, but I just want to come back on...
No, we're not coming back. We're not coming back, because we're going to answer questions tonight so that people...
That's clearly not the question on the table.
What do you mean it's not the question on the table? I put the questions on the table. I put them on the table, and here's the question that's on the table tonight. So...
Is it on the ballot paper? Is it on the ballot paper?
Here's what the SDLP said in 2000... You don't really want me to show this, do you?
No, I don't.
In 2002. Here, let's have a look at this. The SDLP has long been committed to the euro and believes that Northern Ireland increasingly loses out the longer we remain outside the eurozone.
OK, well, for a start, 14 years ago, we're going to come back. 14 years ago was a very long time in economic terms before a number of global shocks. And the fact is...
We had the benefit of hindsight.
I'm not saying that we should... This isn't about joining the euro, and I'm not saying that we should.
Was it wrong? Was your party cock up?
It was at a different time. It was 14 years ago. But I need to come back on a couple of things. One, you ask any business...
Sorry, we will move on after we deal with
Stephen,
it. Was that a complete misjudgment of your party?
No, I think it was of a different time. It was
can you see why this is important? It's because you're saying exactly the same thing now.
I was a teenager. I don't remember.
But not just you guys, but the people who are now telling us that if we're outside the EU, there'll be disinvestment and slow growth and unemployment, said exactly the same thing.
Steve, if we want to talk about the people who are telling us,
that those things didn't happen to us.
And it's you and it's Donald Trump telling us to leave.
It's not just that being outside the euro.
But I need to come back on two other points.
It's all the bad things that you're predicting did happen to the eurozone.
I am going to come back. And I'm going. One, red tape. See this thing about red tape. One, there are a lot of. I don't want to have lead paint in my children's toys. A lot of things. These are some of the regulations that Europe has brought in. You also talk about we could trade and our growth with South Korea has grown. You ask any business person, would they like to increase with their biggest customer, or would they like a tiny increase with their smallest customer?
You're away from red faces to red tape.
On the localism.
The fact of the matter is that many of those who are arguing now that we should stay in the European Union. Many of those who you have cited, and Alastair Campbell will cite, got it wrong about the exchange rate mechanism, they got it wrong about the Eurozone, and they're now using it, employing the same arguments about staying in the EU.
If we want to talk about slow learners, Sammy, there are a lot of things that could have dawned on you many years ago here that would have fixed things. We want to talk about slow learners.
Conor Patterson, where are you, Conor? There you are. You're a businessman, Conor, and you're on the Remain side. Is that right? Tell us why.
Because where I'm based in Uri, we fear, it is Project Fear where we are, the implications of a Brexit. Our economy has been transformed because the border has disappeared as a practical barrier to trade and movement of people. I spoke to Boris Johnson in a very partisan use of Hillsborough Castle by Theresa Villiers when she hosted him there, and asked him these very questions. Will there be a hard border on the island of Ireland? And he couldn't answer me.
Conor. Need to hear you.
The answer is there will be. And there will be a hard border. If it's not in the island of Ireland, there will be a hard border around the island of Britain.
We'll talk about the border later in the programme. Erwin, we're going to talk about the border later in the programme. Cameron. Erwin.
There is no doubt that Ireland and the UK want to continue with the common travel area. They want to work closely together. Now, I think everybody here has got a very dim view of the EU. If they think the EU is going to introduce sanctions against the UK that are actually going to destroy the economy in Southern Ireland, I don't believe it's going to happen. And if the people in Southern Ireland believe it's going to happen, then they will be forced to leave the United Kingdom to keep their economy afloat.
And Michaela Lafferty, where are you? There you are. Even the unions are splitting this, right?
The union is representative, and as public opinion is split, the unions have a difference of opinion. I wouldn't say that we're divided. Europe is not perfect. We're not going to say it's perfect. It's anything but perfect. It hasn't delivered everything we've wanted.
Right. But what's your top line for remaining in terms of the economy?
For jobs, for workers' rights and for peace in Northern Ireland, that's why I'm staying in.
Patrick Hall, you're from NIPSA, another union.
Yeah, I would be, I think, as Claire referred to, on the hard left, or socialist as we would call it, and we would take a different opinion. Our measure of the economic success or failure of the European Union is the country we live in, because we're in the European Union, and frankly it's a disaster at the minute economically. The European Union is a financial disaster as well, an economic disaster.
But do you not accept...
But if I could finish my point, quickly. Can I just say I don't think the public believes a word coming out of either campaign anymore, either the Remain or the Brexit campaign, and that's a real problem. And the last thing I would say, Stephen, is there's a huge issue coming down the tracks, which is the TTIP negotiation, which will mean the demolition of our public services, and nobody's addressing that issue.
No, we're going to point to Michaela, because it's only a point to Michaela. Michaela, if you look at what has happened as a result of the vanity project that the EU elite are pursuing, they have condemned millions of young people in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, to unemployment.
We are
in pursuit of the Eurozone.
We're moving on.
We need to stay in.
Moving on.
That's what the EU is.
We are going to talk about immigration next. Here's John Campbell again.
One of the fundamental principles of EU membership is that all EU citizens should have freedom of movement. As a result, more than 3 million people from elsewhere in the EU are living in the UK. The last census, which dates from 2011, recorded 83,000 people from elsewhere in the EU living here. 37,000 of that group were from the Republic. The vast majority of EU citizens say they're here to work, and the figures bear that out. In 2015, people from EU countries in the UK had a 78% employment rate. That compares to a 73% rate among UK-born people. Overall, the evidence suggests the main economic impacts of EU migration are relatively small and mostly positive. For example, local employers have found it useful to be able to recruit more widely and fill skills gaps. But there's also some evidence which shows higher migration puts downward pressure on the wages of the least skilled workers. If the UK leaves, it would be able to end freedom of movement. But that would come at a price. It would mean the UK would be highly unlikely to have access to the single market on anything like the terms it has now. For example, Norway is not in the EU, but still accepts freedom of movement as the price of market access.
Well, Alastair Campbell, immigration is the weak point in your campaign, isn't it?
Look, I think that you're talking in this campaign about people like me and Claire who've decided on one side and Daniel and Sammy who've decided on the other, and you've got millions of people in the middle who are going to decide for all sorts of reasons. And immigration certainly is a factor within the debate. And I think that one of the reasons why the Leave campaign are really hammering the issue of immigration as heavily as they can, because they know that they've lost the economic argument. However, just addressing the issue of immigration, the reason, you see, it's interesting, I saw Nicola Sturgeon, and it's weird in this debate how we end up sort of quoting favourably people who we're normally on the opposite sides, but Nicola Sturgeon made a very good point, I thought. We keep going on about immigrants and these migrants who come over here and take our jobs and so forth, and the people that British people that we have working in the European Union countries, we call them expats, and there are 2.2 million. And we're actually back here we're back here to the subject of the single market. And Stephen, you quoted at Claire something that the SDLP said a while back. I'd like, if I may, to quote something that Daniel Hannan said just a year ago. He said, the idea is being absurdly propagated that withdrawing from the political institutions of the EU means withdrawing from the single market. No one in Brussels is suggesting such a thing, nor is any British Eurosceptic suggesting such a thing. That is now exactly what the Leave campaign are suggesting.
Daniel Hannan, you want to respond to that?
In every non-EU country in Europe, in the Isle of Man, in Norway, in Serbia, in Turkey, in Switzerland, they are part of a common market. They don't face any tariffs selling into the EU.
But you said we wouldn't have to leave the single market.
That if Britain withdraws from the political institutions of Brussels, that we would be uniquely excluded from market access on the same terms that Guernsey, Macedonia, Monaco, Montenegro, every other non-EU state has.
You don't know that with any certainty whatsoever.
You have to renegotiate. It is always better, Alastair, isn't it, to go with what you can observe. And if you see that every other country, with the sole exception of Belarus, every other country in Europe is part of a common market in Europe, why would we be the only ones uniquely penalised, especially when we are big net purchasers of EU goods, when we would, on the day we left, become their single biggest market?
I'll tell you why. Because I think it's extraordinary. You have made an entire career out of saying that this European Union thing and this Commission thing and all these other European countries determined to do Britain down. But for some reason, the minute that we pull out, they're going to roll over, have their tummies tickled and do everything that we ask them to do.
They will act in self-interest, Alastair. Since they export to us 290 million euros worth of goods, or billion worth of goods and services every year, and we export 220 back to them. They've got a trade surplus with us. But the 6.5 million people who are dependent upon jobs for selling goods into the United Kingdom, they're not going to cut off their nose to spite their face. They need us.
Sammy, let me come into the audience. Guy with the glasses, go ahead.
Yeah, Alastair Campbell talks about making a career. He's made a career of giving people meaningless rhetoric over years and years and years. It's not grounded in any fact.
Do you have a point
it's just
to make?
fantasy.
Do you have a point of substance to make?
Yes, I have a point to make, Alastair.
Well, why didn't you make it?
Last year, we had 24,000 farms registered in Northern Ireland. 15 years ago, we had 32,000. Okay.
And what's going to happen if you come out of Europe and you lose 80% of the subsidies for the farmers?
We'll look at farming later in the programme. I promise you we'll look at farming later in the programme, OK?
Claire is talking about people, OK, about losing their jobs.
I'll tell you what, though, if Alastair doesn't like the career that I've made, he can very easily...
Let the guy speak.
What about the people who work for Cadbury's who lost their jobs when the factories were moved to Poland with EU grant money? What about the people who built Ford Transits who lost their jobs to Turkey with EU grant money? EU money that we pay for people to lose jobs in the UK.
Thank you. Guy here in the glasses. Go ahead. Quickly, go ahead.
Can I just say to the Leave, Sammy, Daniel, one of the most prized institutions in this country is the National Health Service. That relies on foreign nationals coming in to work. Our nurses, our doctors, OK? Our tourism industry relies on foreign nationals. Now, can you honestly tell me that if we leave the European Union, you're going to find those doctors, those nurses, those cleaners. No, listen. Where are you going to find them from?
Well, because the important thing about the immigration policy is that if we were to leave the EU, we would then have control over immigration policy. We would decide what skill shortages there were.
Would you want more or less? Spell out to me what you would want, more or less.
It would depend upon the needs of the economy.
You don't know.
No, it would depend upon the needs of the economy.
So the Leave campaigner might actually want more immigrants.
If you have a shortage of doctors, if you have a shortage of nurses, if you have a shortage of people in certain skills, then of course you would seek them from outside. But the important thing is this: you would not have the uncontrolled immigration at present, which is causing and putting pressure on the health service, our housing, our education, and everything else.
Hold on, there's no point shouting. Hold on. Let me go. Claire, I'll let you come back 1 second.
If
go ahead, sir.
They're not coming from the EU. Where are you going to get them from, Sammy? Yeah. The doctors that we have here and we train in Northern Ireland are going to Australia, they're going to China, and they're going to America. The nurses that we have here, we're trained here, go abroad. You are not going to get the nurses who are trained here staying, and you're not going to get them coming from those other countries where they're trained. You're going to get people from the Philippines. So you're going to exclude those people who come from Europe.
Let him reply
and bring
to you.
people from even further
let Sammy
afield.
reply to you. Go on, Sammy.
Madness. You would do exactly the same as they do in Australia, where you would look and see where the skill shortages. You would award points to people. Do you want to hear the answer?
Do you want to hear Sammy reply? You shouldn't be part of a little Englander attitude.
We're going to let Sammy reply, sir.
You need to broaden your horizons,
One second, man. 1 second. Let's let Sammy reply, then you can come back, all right?
You do exactly the same as they do in other countries where they operate a point system, where you look and see what skill shortages you have, people apply to come into the country, they're awarded points, and on the basis of that, they are accepted into the country as immigrants because you know you've got jobs for them, you know you've got the skill shortages, and you marry your immigration policy with the needs of your economy.
And Sammy,
that makes sense.
Sammy, with this great Australian model that you're talking about, Sammy, hasn't immigration gone up?
Doubled.
But that's because Australia had skill shortages.
So it's gone up.
And if there were skill shortages, yes, you would.
And are there skill shortages?
But ideally, what we should be doing here is if we've got shortages of nurses, we train our own people to be nurses. If we've got shortages of doctors, we train our own people to be doctors. But if we can't fill those gaps, then we bring them from outside.
The fact is that migration is market sensitive. People come where the job opportunities are, in the same way as people from all over this island for centuries have gone to other places for jobs. But the other fact is that migration is good for our economy, and that is something you've been trying to bluff on. In Northern Ireland, 1.2 billion added in, and most of the workers coming in are young, strong people who, fact prove, they pay in.
Claire, you tell that to the people who have lost their jobs.
Taxation. Let me speak. They pay in taxation far more than they use in public service.
There's no point shouting because we can't hear you. We'll bring a mic to you, and then you can speak. Just put your hand up, and I promise we'll come to you. You can finish your point.
You do not want an economy that's based on labour shortages, because nobody will invest in it if there aren't people to fill the jobs. And the other thing, all these people shouting about the rights of low-paid workers. For a start, these guys aren't going to be the ones to defend it. There are domestic policies. If they were serious about protecting low-paid workers, they could legislate on zero-hour contracts. They could introduce a proper minimum wage.
We're going in the audience now. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Yes, you.
Stephen, thank you. In November last year, David Cameron was interviewed on TV, and he was asked what would happen if we left the EU. And in that interview, David Cameron said absolutely nothing. He said nothing would happen to the economy, that we would thrive. Entrepreneurs would start...
I've never read David Cameron saying that.
Well, it was on the TV,
it is a fact, without question, that as recently as February, he was threatening to walk out over what we now see was an unbelievably trivial tweak to our welfare rules. So the idea that it would be a bomb under the economy
He's done
is
a complete
fantasy.
U-turn. And no matter what happens in this referendum, whether we stay or whether we leave, the UK government will never, ever be the same again.
OK, John Campbell.
Stephen, just on the point of migration, an important point to make is that it doesn't affect everybody equally. It may be good for the whole economy overall, but it's experienced differently. So there are people who will have their wages depressed. There's Bank of England research which suggests that a very small downward pressure on the lowest skilled people in the service sector. And so the impact of migration, while it's good on average, is not evenly distributed across all jobs.
I understand why we're talking about jobs here tonight, right? Because obviously it's important. But there's a lot more that we haven't discussed yet. For example, the pressure on public services in this country that is a topic within the immigration debate that is absolutely massive. The people born and bred in this country, they want to be able to find, Claire, a place for their children in school. They want to be able to walk into the NHS and feel like the NHS can cope with the demand that the population of this country has.
Stephen, that is a domestic policy consideration which can be addressed by the government. You're talking there because we've got a Conservative austerity government that isn't putting the money into public services that it should. That is not the responsibility of the European Union.
And Alastair, you had this exact same pressures on education, on health, on housing when the Labour government was in power and when the Labour government was spending money hand over fist.
But you
still had the exact same pressures, and mostly in working class areas, because that's where the impact of uncontrolled immigration was felt most strong.
Alastair can reply to that. Go on, Alastair.
If I heard Sammy right, he was saying that we let uncontrolled immigration, and that's led to these massive pressures on public services. I don't deny that in a lot of communities, people have felt those pressures. However, as Claire said earlier, we have always needed, right throughout history, we've needed immigrants at certain stages of economic development to come in and do the jobs. For example, 100,000 people in the UK, European immigrants, working in our health and social and care system, doing the jobs.
But do you recognise, Alastair, that some people in certain areas of the United Kingdom feel that there is too much pressure because of immigration on local services and their local-born kids, and they themselves can't access them anymore?
I accept people feel that in some places. However, we go back to the point. There's no point shouting because I can't see you and I can't hear you.
You need to not shout, all right? There's no point. Actually, you're making a fool of yourself because you're shouting to yourself because we can't hear you.
You're talking to me or him, Stephen?
Wait until we get a mic to you, and then we'll come to you. I promise. All right?
Alastair is talking about the austerity government. I'm going to repeat this. In the whole of the last Parliament, the austerity cuts put together saved £36 billion. During the lifetime of that Parliament, our gross contribution to the EU was £85 billion. Our net contribution was £42 billion. So even if we insist on using this lower figure, that one cut would have wiped out the whole of the austerity programme and still have given us enough lever to take a penny off.
I want to keep them a promise tonight. Who was the guy that was shouting? I want to put a mic to you. Where was the guy that was shouting? Sir, go ahead. The mic's on you now. We can all hear you. Go ahead.
OK. Our fathers and our grandfathers and their grandfathers worked their butts off to build up, and they died early as a result of it, now, and quite apart from dying on the battlefield, to build up the infrastructure of this country and to protect our culture. And these people are now suggesting that we can have all these foreigners coming in who are not prepared in very many circumstances to adopt our culture. We are being derogatory towards our forebears.
Go ahead, Chris. You can respond to him.
We've enough problems in Northern Ireland deciding what our own culture is. We can't complain about other people not adapting when we can't adapt to our own.
OK, we're going to move on. Our next subject, the Northern Ireland dimension. This place has featured as an issue in the referendum campaign actually quite a bit. There have been claims and counter-claims about what would happen to the Irish border in the event of a vote for breakfast. John Campbell will set out some of the issues.
Currently, people can move freely between Northern Ireland, the Republic, and the rest of the UK without passport checks. That's due to something known as the Common Travel Area. It's a fairly informal arrangement which predates the creation of the EU. Both the UK and Irish governments would push to see it continue if the UK left the EU, but we can't be certain that it will. Some legal experts say it could only continue with the agreement of other EU countries. If there's no agreement, we could either see a harder border or more checks when you're travelling to Great Britain from any part of this island. There's also the possibility we could see the return of customs posts. If a post-Brexit trade deal didn't include free access to each other's markets, then things like tariffs would have to be enforced at or close to the border. This happens at other EU borders, such as the one between Norway and Sweden. There's also the possibility a Brexit could lead to another referendum in Scotland. The SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon has said a vote to leave the EU against Scotland's wishes would almost certainly trigger an independence referendum.
That shows you, by the way, the pressure these politicians are putting me under. Apparently, I said a vote for breakfast just because I think about food all the time. Right, good stuff. Where are we going now? Tom Kelly, on the border. Important issue here in Northern Ireland. We've seen Tony Blair, no less, John Major coming over and warning us that this border issue, it could risk the peace process, no less.
Well, first of all, I don't need Tony Blair or John Major to warn me. I live on the border, and I've lived there for the past 50 years of my life. And as someone who knows that until the single market went, leaving aside all the historical stuff about common travel area and all of that, which is nonsense, I used to go to the dogs on a Friday night and a Saturday night from Newry, and you had to make sure that you didn't get in timing with the lorries who were going to cross through the customs posts at Dundalk. There was customs posts at Omeath. The reality somehow, for people who clearly didn't go to the border during the past 50 years, there was a border there until the single market, and it will come back. And that's the biggest fear, because we are actually reliant, our businesses, I feel I'm on another planet tonight, they're talking about businesses that don't exist. The businesses here in Northern Ireland, 57% of them trade with the Republic of Ireland. They need to export and they need to be tariff-free.
Okay.
Let's talk about here and stop talking about East Anglia.
Jeffrey,
we want Northern Ireland first.
Well, the fact is the common travel area has been in existence since partition. There have been hiccups during the war and obviously during the Troubles, but the fact is that it works, and both governments want it. As recently as 2011, it was ratified by both governments. If you go to the Irish government website,
But that's because
you'll
they're
see how
both
much
inside
it's
the
welcome.
European Union.
You'll see how much it's welcomed by the Irish government.
That's
We
because
do
they're
have
both
free movement
inside
and trade.
the EU.
And as Dan has made the point on many occasions that now we do actually have the internet. It's not that difficult to move goods across borders. We can move goods from Turkey to Greece.
Alastair Campbell wants to speak to you. Go on, Alastair.
Can one of these Leave people explain to me how you can have this bring back control of the borders, so as you know everybody who's coming in without having border control?
Yes, I'd like to then.
Can you do that?
It's always better to start with.
But Daniel Hannan is actually nearly jumping off his seat to tell you.
Rather than listening to hypothesis or promises, look at what's happening now. There is a common travel area that includes two EU states, the Republic of Ireland and the UK. Also includes the Isle of Man, which is not in the EU. Also includes the Channel Islands, which are not in the EU. So as a matter of observable fact, you can have the common travel area with EU and non-EU territories.
Stephen, can I deal with this?
If you're now going to argue that someone is going to bring back the border, you have to find either a party in Dublin or a party in Westminster that is proposing such a thing.
Well, Alastair
Campbell, 1 second. Alastair.
In which case, Daniel, your entire case falls down. Let's say I'm one of these terrible Polish builders that wants to come over here and undercut builders in London. All I've got to do, if the UK, come out of the European Union, get on a plane from Warsaw to Dublin. I'll be part of the single market, because Dublin will still be part of the single market. I get up to this border, and if you tell me there's no border controls, I just come into the United Kingdom.
Go to the Isle of Man. You'll be able to do that.
You don't need visas to fly here.
Well,
how do you do that?
He's right.
You don't need
How are you going to stop me coming
in?
He's right, is he not? Because if you have...
We're going to stop anyone travelling here.
Sammy,
stop people travelling.
Hold on. Sammy.
Nobody's suggesting we stop people travelling.
If we have no border checks whatsoever, then how are you stopping a situation that Alastair Campbell just suggested?
First of all, how does the common travel area operate at the moment?
Because we're both in the same European Union, for heaven's sake.
Because there is not...
we have visa
the Irish Republic deliberately did not sign up to the free travel area. It stayed out of the Schengen arrangement because it valued the common travel area.
Okay.
So the checks take place at Irish ports. People come into Ireland and therefore are free to move.
Young lady here in the audience, go ahead.
And they have said, the Irish ambassador and the Irish foreign minister said they will maintain that.
This young lady here.
Sally, listen, I actually travelled across the border today. I came up from Dublin for this today, and hassle-free, may I add. I actually looked at the DUP website, and what it says is they want to move the north of Ireland forward. But surely if we're put up a border, that's bringing us straight back. Have people in this room forgot what the border was like? I'm a student in UCD. I travel across the border on a weekly basis. I certainly don't want to be stopped at the border. Let me finish the point, please. You don't travel across the border, Sammy. Let me finish the point.
I am not suggesting it's a Third World War. It's a border. It's
is not suggesting
if we leave the EU, the reality is we will have border control. Because as well as this, you have to remember that the Northern Ireland is the only place within the UK, if we decide to leave, that's actually touching a member state, which is the south of Ireland. So of course there's going to have to be security checks. It'd be ludicrous to think otherwise.
Well, there wouldn't, because the security checks are done, and the checks are done when people come into the Irish Republic. That's why it's not a conduit at the moment. It's not a conduit.
And the Irish government agreed to it.
Listen.
At what stage the Irish government said they would check for the Northern Ireland?
I know we're passionate about this, but you've got to let me share this, or here's what's going to happen. No, I'm not going to let you just answer that, because Claire's going to speak now, and then if you're nice to me, you can answer it.
Well,
all right?
I'm always nice to you, Stephen. I'm always nice to you.
On that, I think the whole tenor of the campaign has been about Johnny Foreigner, so the logical extension is going to be they have to police the border. But it isn't just about the fact that the border exists. It's the fact that Europe has underwritten the peace here, has invested literally billions in peace, and it's provided a framework so that the border is less in your face, and so that Britain and Ireland have been able to relate to each other and trade together as good neighbours and as equals, and to overcome common problems. And that is the whole fundamental. Let's not. The man referred to 100 years ago people dying on battlefields. You're absolutely right. They did, and for 1,000 years before that, Europe was at war, and then people had the vision that working together instead of at odds with one another would bring peace, and it has worked, and it's the most successful conflict resolution plan in the world.
And Claire, on every occasion that Europe went to war, if you go right back through history, it was because people tried to force a unity on the countries of Europe, either through war, either through marriages, either through treaties or whatever. Where
are you doing what I think you're doing? Are you comparing the European Union to Nazism again?
Where countries objected to it. I'm not. I'm saying that you look at every European war that ever happened, and it was all about people having territorial ambitions and political ambitions to unite Europe, and that's exactly where we're heading to.
It was about nation states butting against each other,
where we're putting tensions
and the Treaty of Rome
countries as a result of trying to unify.
You're turning your back on your neighbours. That's putting tensions. The Treaty of Rome was about common endeavour, and so was the Good Friday Agreement.
I'm going into the audience to Hayden now.
Thank you.
Are you weeping for Greek democracy? Is that what you're doing?
Thank you very much. Hayden in the audience. Where are you, Hayden?
No, I just think the idea of a hard border between Northern Ireland and Republic is complete fallacy. So it is. Like, we've had all the scare tactics from the Chancellor to the two former Prime Ministers and other people they say about border checks, armed guards, this, that, whatever kind of thing. And I think even today during PM2s, the Prime Minister sort of softened the stance, saying there may be sort of, in the event of leaving, checking passports if you're going from Northern Ireland into mainland Britain. I think, in fact, if we do leave next week, then what could happen is, if there is going to be a hard border, that may come into place if the Republic decide to join the Schengen Agreement, which means that they would be the ones that would put in a border between the two countries.
Are you not worried, Sammy, about the breakup of the UK as a unionist?
I don't believe it.
If Scotland leaves?
Well, first of all, Scotland can't leave. I mean, this is not about Scotland leaving. This is a referendum. This is a
localism for you.
This is a UK referendum.
Scotland can't leave.
Not as a result of this referendum, Stephen.
It could lead to it, couldn't it?
No, it couldn't.
Stephen, can I please?
First of all, this referendum is a UK referendum about whether or not we stay in the EU or leave the EU. The issue of whether Scotland has another referendum about leaving the UK will depend upon the right conditions being available there, the right conditions being there, and the economic conditions.
Alastair, you wanted to come in, and I need you to be quick, Alastair.
The Scottish government doesn't intend to have such a referendum.
The point I wanted to make, Stephen, is that if the UK votes to come out, but there's a fairly significant majority in Scotland to stay in, Nicola Sturgeon, I think, has her excuse for the second referendum. I think she should be entitled to have a second referendum. And even with the low oil price, I think the politics in Scotland have changed sufficient for that to happen. So Sammy sits there as the defender of the Union. He ought to just understand that if he carries on with the policy he's pursuing, it could be this policy that leads to the breakup of the United States.
That's the same as her weapons of mass destruction predictions. That's the same as Saddam Hussein being able to bomb Britain in 45 minutes.
Daniel Hannan. All right. Listen, we've had
Daniel Hannan.
We have had nothing but this fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The Remain guys, they haven't. It's not just they haven't said anything nice about this country. They haven't even said anything nice about the EU. They've spent the whole campaign saying that there'll be war, that there'll be famine, that there'll be the end of Western civilization, that we'll never get the Olympics again, and now the local version of it here, that the border will come back and that the UK will break apart. You haven't had one positive thing to say. And the reason you haven't is because no one would be joining the EU today. You know that. Given the state it's in now, with the unfolding Schengen disaster, the unfolding Euro disaster, if we were not already in, no one would be suggesting that we join it.
Make your mind up. Make your mind up. Excuse me, Stephen.
Quickly, Alastair.
You cannot be allowed to talk this drivel. You cannot be allowed to come with this drivel. The other day, I saw him on the television saying that if we stay in the European Union, we're going to have to watch all these other countries coming in. Albania, Serbia, Macedonia, any country they think they can scare people with. And they go on about the Project Fear. The reason people are right to go on about Project Fear is because there's a lot to be scared of if we come out of the United States.
All right, thank you. John Campbell.
Just one very brief observation on Scotland, Stephen. While the price of oil is at $50 a barrel or below, I don't think the economic case for an independent Scotland looks particularly strong.
OK, right, we're moving on. Our final subject tonight is farming and fisheries, very important to this part of the world. It's Mr John Campbell again.
Northern Ireland farmers received £236 million in direct EU subsidies last year. Without that support, farming as a whole would have made no profit. A further £83 million was paid in rural development grants. If we leave the EU, that system would have to be replaced. Most developed countries do have a subsidy system. The Remain side say there's no guarantees Westminster or Stormont would replace all the EU funds. The Leave side say subsidies could be more generous. And it's true that non-EU countries like Norway do give more support to farmers, but that tends to make food more expensive for consumers. Farmers would also like less red tape, but any subsidy system will involve some bureaucracy and environmental protection rules. Our fishing industry is also governed by EU rules. They're intended to prevent overfishing and make the trade economically and environmentally sustainable. But that involves a high level of oversight, with strict rules on what fish can be caught and how much. There's also the issue of what sort of trade deal the UK would get after a Brexit. We currently export just under 30% of our agricultural produce to the EU. If we don't get a comprehensive deal, meat and milk products could face high export tariffs. A deal that involves good market access would probably mean we still have to follow many EU rules. But the Leave side think we might find it easier to get into new markets if we're not in the EU.
Right, let's go into the audience straight away. Melissa.
Vanessa is the name.
Vanessa, my fault.
Yes, well, I would just like to say I'm a farmer's wife, and actually we're finding that agriculture now, with being in the EU, since the basic payment and greening system has come in, farmers' payments have actually gone down. And they are going down every 2 years now, and there's no guarantee after 2020 that those payments will continue. So from our point of view, before Britain was in the European Union, farmers did receive a good programme of subsidies, and the National Farmers Union could actually argue their case every year to ensure that there was good benefits for farmers.
OK,
and
Mark?
locally based.
Well, Mark.
Basically, for the vote leave, if we do leave, the rules and regulations, will we be able to press our politicians to help actually take away some of those rules and regulations?
You're a farmer, Mark, are you?
Dairy farmer.
And what's your question?
About rules and regulations.
So after the Common Agricultural and Common Fisheries policies have both been disastrous for us. The CAP is the most amoral, wasteful, expensive system. It's ruinous for developing countries, it's bad for consumers, and it's bad for farmers. The CFP has created an ecological catastrophe in our waters. And the only argument that I've heard against bringing them back, either to Westminster or to the devolved administrations, is the one that the young guy here said, which is, we don't trust our politicians. But you know what? That gets to the root of what this whole referendum is about. People from all over this island, from all over the British Isles, were prepared in the last analysis to defend with force of arms our right to make our own laws.
Are those gross promises we should buy into, or net promises?
This is a serious point, Steve. This is a really serious point. You know, my dad fought in the last war with the North Irish Horse so that we could live in a free country that makes its own laws.
OK.
We are talking about keeping those rights for our kids.
Melissa.
Stephen, you know you want to go down that one.
Are you a farmer, Melissa?
No. Unfortunately, I'm a country person who goes with a farmer, but we disagree.
Unfortunately.
On the subject. Well, but my question to Remain is on the subsidies again. If we leave, the government takes control of the subsidies, and how can we be guaranteed that they remain the same? They could drop. With farming already on its knees.
They will drop because the economy
How do we guarantee? Can we take the risk?
They're dropping already. And indeed, the figure which John quoted there is £120 million less than the
But they
years
could drop
before.
even more.
So they are dropping already. That's the first thing. The second thing is this, that we have always, even before we joined the EU, we have always had a system of farm subsidies because, of course, farming supplies the raw material for one of our major industries, the agri-food industry. And of course we need to protect that because we employ so many people in the agri-food industry. And of course the last thing is this, that even if let's say we did have the European Union in a fit of pique putting up barriers to our farmers and saying you can't sell in Europe, since we're net importers of food, import substitution would actually give farmers a market in our own.
John McCalthy, you're a former MLA. Go on, John.
Well, two things. Look, Sammy mentioned the single market. We currently, agri-food employs nearly 100,000 people here. It's a massive industry in Northern Ireland, and you need access to the single market. Subsidies, we've been dependent on subsidies more through the strength of French farmers, German farmers, Irish farmers, not UK government. UK government, successive UK governments have been very reluctant to go down supporting CAP or even paying into CAP. So what I would warn my fellow farmers about is that you are dependent on Westminster giving Stormont the money and Stormont coming up with a policy.
Claire?
Well, yeah, I mean, for a start, there's no guarantee that any of that money would be replaced. And you asked about the rules and regulation. If we're going to pay, if we're going to be in the single market, you have to comply with those rules and you don't get a say. But at the moment, a third of our exports are in agri-food. It's only 3% in GB, so you have entirely different policy. But that money has allowed us to modernise, it's allowed us to diversify. It has done things like protect Loch Ness eels. But this is another case of you putting all the ills of an industry, blaming it on the EU, and suddenly your magic sovereignty dust is going to go and undo all the bad decisions that the Tories made.
We'll still have problems, Claire, but they'll be our problems, and you know what? I think we can make a better fist of it than Juncker.
Let's talk about your problems. Like we talk about fisheries, and that is an industry that has a lot of problems, but a big part of it is the fact that the quota is decided by the UK government and they sell it off to big business. And if you want to talk about localism, by the way, Tories have a majority that would make an EU commissioner blush.
1 second, Alastair. I want to come back to the farmer guy here. Go ahead, quickly now, quickly for me.
Back to the coast of Ireland, there's two massive fish factory ships, Russian ships, and they can catch all they want and they can sell to us. And we come back to the exporting to the EU. 56% of the British beef is imported from Ireland. 56% of the butter is imported to Britain. 28% of the cheese is imported to Britain. We go on here about subsidies. Everybody in this room has to eat.
Okay, and the guy behind you. Go ahead, Chris.
That's the start.
Currently, Northern Ireland is a net beneficiary of agriculture subsidies from Europe. If we take that away and the British government gives it back into Northern Ireland, surely the British government should want Northern Ireland to leave, because we'd be exactly the same boat. You'd be sending money to Northern Ireland and not getting enough back.
Okay, Alastair, quickly.
Yeah, what it was, Stephen, is when I was sort of just researching a bit this afternoon, I came across a statement by the Ulster Farmers Union President Ian Marshall, and I think it's really important this. So there's the guy who's actually representing farmers.
You need to be quick.
The CAP is vital for farm incomes, and no alternative support measures are being put forward by Brexit. And that goes to the heart of Sammy Wilson and Daniel Hannan. They moan and they groan and the rest of it. We come out of Europe, all's going to be fine. They have not put forward a single proposal
Alistair,
to
the important thing is
the trade arrangements
that agricultural subsidies would be tailored to the needs of the farming industry here in Northern Ireland.
Well, the money's just going to get magically by that.
And the very fact that we import so much of our food into the United Kingdom from the EU is the reason why the EU will not block Irish farmers and Northern Ireland farmers selling to EU.
Well, these people want to destroy
they our market, and therefore we'll have
run out of time.
Sammy talks a lot about trade deficits. Do we experiment? See, the next time you're getting your groceries in, you go into Tesco and tell them that they sell you more than you sell them, and see how you get on. But the fact is, it is about a market that we can sell into. You have no guarantee. The Tories have shown they're practically allergic to spending a single penny more. They won't. One, the economy will collapse, or not collapse, it'll contract, and they won't have the money to spend. But if they do get it, they'll do it in tax cuts for the rich. They won't give it to our struggling farmers. 86% of the income comes from the EU. You've no guarantee.
Well, listen, anybody who says nobody cares at this debate, look at this debate tonight in Northern Ireland, the passion that's been here. I'm just a wee bit depressed when I look at Twitter, and Colin here says everyone arguing about breakfast and Stephen Nolan more concerned about his breakfast. But sure,
priorities.
You said breakfast that's again. All we've had time for tonight. The debate will continue, but on June the 23rd,
you said breakfast again, Dave. You really are obsessed with it.
The talking will stop. It's been lovely having all your company tonight. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Sammy. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Alastair. And thank you all in the audience too. Night, night, everybody.